think that Inside Out 2 might actually be the most anticipated movie of 2024, other than maybe Deadpool. Yes, because it's the sequel of a very beloved film that has not been franchised to death yet, but I also know because most people are at least keeping an eye on it because they know Disney desperately needs a win. Which looks like has in fact happened. This is shaping up to be the biggest box office weekend of the entire year so far. But again, opening weekend box offices are usually reflective of hype more than quality, which tends to be reflected more on the follow-up weekends. And at this point, it doesn't matter how much money it made. I'm still expecting a report at the end of the year to tell us, even though this movie apparently broke all of the records, it still somehow lost $200 million. It is a thought that when the first film came out in 2015, one of the largest praises was how original it was, to the point where a bulk of online discourse was a buttload of killjoys who were on some sort of mission to prove how unoriginal it was by comparing it to Osmosis Jones or some 90s sitcom no one had ever heard of. While of course people have been using the personification of mental processes in animation and otherwise since the beginning, including Disney, but particularly that point was to emphasize people's frustration with Pixar's then recent sequel trend, a whole 3 non-Toy Story sequels. But now, with the release of Inside Out 2, not simply meaning that it's ironic that Inside Out 2 exists, but that Pixar has actually made quite a lot of originals that have all just failed to meet company projections, dominantly due to their own freaking fault of not releasing things in theaters, but the pandemic has honestly made a whole bunch of the industry panic and do some very stupid things. This is one of the few Pixar sequels that many people genuinely wanted to take its concept of personification of emotional and mental processes to tackle puberty. So now, having seen it, I think that Inside Out 2 is 90% there to being a really great film. As said, people were really anticipating to see Inside Out tackle puberty, and pretty much from one of the opening scenes where Riley has a very extreme emotional reaction to the emotions only lightly touching the console, I knew that we were definitely in the right wheelhouse. Inside Out 2 definitely retains the clever adaptation of psychological concepts in clever and funny ways, even if they aren't always perfectly metaphorically accurate. This time, rather than Riley's family, we venture into friendship dynamics where Riley struggles between her old friends and potential new friends, and the dreaded clique dilemma, classic teenage stuff, but more specifically, this is about the adolescent struggle of the transition between her childhood self they've gotten comfortable with into something more perceivably socially acceptable, as Riley and Joy naturally fall back on their old childhood habits that used to make them happy, only to find that now they get them into trouble and make them look immature. This is a brilliant first step. The first movie was all about core memories and how that built a person's personality. Inside Out 2's new step of that, as the brain becomes more complex in adolescence, incorporates the new mental process of beliefs that form the sense of self, or self-appointed narratives like I am a good person, and how actions will usually circle around supporting that narrative. But when your childhood self starts clashing with new experiences and growing knowledge of how the larger world works, adolescents are compelled to want to change everything about themselves to drastically prove that they are not babies anymore, as well as how those new expanded life experiences affect those self-narratives that start to become a lot less positive as they realize how little of the world they actually know or have control of. I love everything about this! But as an animated film, we also have to make sure that the characters are compelling and entertaining. The emotions are still as likable and energetic as they were, discussed especially getting a lot more screen time, which makes a certain amount of sense. I still absolutely adore this movie's design and color palette and score, and I like that this time when the emotions get into yet another kerfuffle that compels them to wander aimlessly throughout the mindscape, that this time Joy takes the other 3 emotions while sadness becomes the secret contact at headquarters after it's been taken over by the new adolescent emotions. With the big new character focus, of course, being anxiety, which is conceptually one of the most brilliant things they could have done, as anxiety and mental stress is a very prevalent topic, showing anxiety broadly as a compulsion to think of everything that could go wrong in the future in order to act accordingly for a particular ideal future, but often in short-term, limited, and rash ways. Now, of course, a big caveat and point of discussion that comes up whenever media talks about mental health is you always have the people who appropriately talk about how the movie's depiction is often simplistic and limited. This isn't how depression or anxiety works, because my depression and anxiety is different, which is definitely always a good discussion to have. There are, in fact, hundreds of ways in which mental health and behaviors manifest, just hopefully also being a little understanding that the movie can't cover everything. But sure, not everyone who suffers from anxiety is compelled to be this proactive. Plenty of people react completely the opposite and freeze and shut down. But as broad representation and an intro to the concept that also incorporates many common adolescent behaviors such as awkwardness, confusion, and drastic actions, I think that this was a great direction to go. And what was just as brilliant was having joy and anxiety as almost fundamentally opposite forces, where joy is literally all about being optimistic, largely by trying to recreate positive memories of the past, which doesn't always help in accounting for the unknown variables of the future. Anxiety works by imagining all of the absolute worst scenarios, making Riley often so terrified and on edge that it compels her into action, fearing that making her too happy would make her too complacent. The adolescent compulsion for pessimism is almost perfectly explained. This is amazing. And then just as amazingly, visually represented by having anxiety literally have taken over the imagination center of the brain that used to be Joy's territory, and that new imagination is framed as animators working tirelessly for the orders of a relentless corporate overlord as opposed to being able to express themselves in the way that they want to. This is a Disney corporate clap back slow clap. I love the delusional joy scene. I wish it had been a bigger focus of the film. And there's also a lot of really funny gags like in the first movie, like the characters locked in the mental vault and the sarcasm. One of the other characters was another childhood icon that I was worried at first was going to try and take the place of Bing Bong, but thankfully it was just a two-off gag that I thought more people would find annoying, but apparently Pouchy is proving to be very popular on the internet right now. So I am largely very happy with Inside Out 2. But, as is the common takeaway at this point, no, it doesn't hit in the same way that the first one did, and in those cases, it's always fair to point out that the original will always take precedent because it's original, and it serves as a point of comparison for people to constantly judge the sequels. But there are still some things that just don't feel quite as tight or thought through as they were in the first movie. One of the best concepts that really defines Inside Out's take on emotions, that makes it feel so teachable and relevant, is grounding the emotions in a purpose. Anger is about being fair, fear is about protecting you, well, really that all the emotions in one way or another are protecting you, but other than saying that anxiety is about planning for the future, it does not say what the purposes of the other emotions are. But more so, they really just don't do very much. They're mostly just comedic sound bites that, well, I would say are anxiety enablers, which does work both metaphorically and narratively for embarrassment and envy, but ennui is kind of the opposite of that, which I guess you could say it's a reaction to a certain kind of mental stress with detachment. And it has been a common point that envy doesn't feel particularly envious. Rather, it's more like envy is treated as emulation rather than the resentment we would expect it to be. And the middle of the movie does have a little bit of a lull. There's that moment where Joy is sitting on a pile of memories, kind of like from the first film, and then goes something like, "What do we do now?" or "What am I missing?" And I was like, that's the writers talking to themselves. Which does make you appreciate what Bing Bong brought to the first movie. Not necessarily the tragic element, but just how having him there made the interactions and the dialogue and the comedy just a little bit more compelling. Because even as I was glad to see the other emotions sharing in the travels, most of the time they're just complaining while Joy does all of the work. I mean, that is, like, narratively relevant, it just wasn't as interesting. Whereas the other movie, I felt like they contributed more narratively by being the ones to propel Riley to run away. Then the ending is great in a lot of ways, but still felt like it just needed a little bit of something to really bring everything together. Because the sense of self is a fantastic concept for what this movie's going for, though a little vague in implementation, which just means that audiences will be somewhat divided if the vagueness makes it more brilliant or frustrating. Just because the first movie had a little bit more of a clear trajectory and cause and effect when it came to its conclusion. Though I did have an idea whether or not it would help to have a visual representation of something like a stress gauge to add both both consequences of anxiety, but also a ticking clock element to the finale. Or would that have been too on the nose? Still, I am really glad this is doing well, and this movie was a nice distraction from reminding me of the fact that Lin-Manuel Miranda is doing songs for the live Lion King sequel, and not Moana 2, because they decided in the last minute to turn a series into a movie and hired people whose only experience with musical theater was an unofficial Bridgerton musical, which means it still has no excuse to be worse than Wish, but still! Why are you giving your resources to the live aesthetic garbage that nobody likes instead of your animated musicals, which have made your company? And yes, because Lin-Manuel had supposedly been working on this for like already a year before they decided to up Moana 2 to this year. And we're not even going to talk about the interview, which Pete Docter has already kind of sort of walked back. But you know what? We can't control the future, we can only appreciate what's in front of us right now. Inside Out 2 turned out good, X-Men 97 was amazing, I've been enjoying Adventures with Superman and looking forward to Wild Robot and The Imaginary and Arcane 2, and will Stolas ever get any degree of self-awareness ever? Monkey Kid Season 5 is coming out eventually, the actual live shows that I watch occasionally, and maybe Moana 2 will turn out fine. All we can do is accept what comes at us and hope that sometime between now and then, nothing at all happens to Bob Iger's helicopter. So tell me, Animaniacs, how did you feel about Inside Out 2, and what are you looking forward to in 2024? I get overwhelmed so easily, my anxiety creeps inside of me, makes it hard to breathe, what's come over me feels like I'm somebody else. I get overwhelmed so easily, my anxiety keeps me silent. When I try to speak, what's come over me feels like I'm somebody else. I get overwhelmed